Okay, so you want to own a cell tower. The pitch sounds almost boring. Build a steel pole, a carrier bolts some antennas onto it, and every month a check shows up. It's real estate with a signal on top. Passive income basically forever. Here's what nobody tells you: the tower itself is almost worthless. What you're actually buying is the right to rent the same 60 square feet of steel 3 or 4 times over to companies that are contractually obligated to keep paying you more every single year for the next quarter century, whether they use the tower more, less, or barely at all. By the end of this video, you'll know what a cell tower is actually selling, and it isn't cell service. It's not even really the tower. How a single pole in a cornfield can clear 6 figures a year from tenants who never interact with each other. The one contract clause that turns a $250,000 pole into a bond-like annuity worth millions. Why the most dangerous job in America is buried 3 layers beneath a business most people think of as boring and safe. Here's what it costs to start. A small tower, a basic monopole out in a rural search ring, one carrier, no frills, runs $150,000 to $250,000 to build. That covers pre-development work like site acquisition and structural analysis, the steel and concrete, and the foundation. For that money, you get one tenant, one lease, and a pole standing in a field that most people will never notice. A real mid-tier build, the kind independent tower companies actually chase, costs $250,000 to $600,000 and sometimes climbs past $1 million for complex or specialty sites. Stealth towers disguised as flagpoles or pine trees, rooftop installs in dense cities, anything with tricky permitting or a difficult structural load. This is the version built to hold 3 or 4 tenants from day one. Then there's the top tier, and it isn't really a single tower, it's the company. American Tower Corporation started in 1995 as a subsidiary spun out of a Boston radio broadcaster, with about 2,500 towers to its name. Today it owns roughly 149,000 communications sites across the US, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia Pacific, and it pulled in just over $10 billion in revenue in 2024. It isn't a construction company anymore. It's a real estate investment trust, legally required to pay out at least 90% of its taxable income to shareholders every year, the same structure used for shopping malls and apartment buildings. Here's the cost nobody warns you about going in: the ground lease. Most tower operators don't own the dirt under the tower. They lease it, usually for 25 to 30 years with automatic renewals from a landowner, a church, a farmer, a school district. Median rent on that ground lease runs around $22,750 a year, though it swings wildly, anywhere from a few dollars a month to nearly $20,000 a month depending on location. That lease is a permanent, compounding liability sitting underneath your asset, and it's the single biggest thing tower buyers underestimate. Now the question that actually matters: where does the money come from? Because it's barely from providing cell service, the tower owner doesn't provide service at all. A tower with exactly one tenant is a bad investment. It's basically break-even once you account for the ground lease, insurance, maintenance, and the capital you sunk into steel and concrete. The entire business model hinges on one word the industry calls co-location, and here's why it's the whole game. Stream 1, the anchor tenant. The first carrier on the tower pays base rent, typically $1,500 to $3,500 a month, or $18,000 to $42,000 a year. This barely covers your costs. This tenant is the loss leader. Stream 2, the one most people miss. Every additional tenant is almost pure profit. The tower, the land, the foundation, all of it is already paid for. When a second or third carrier signs on to the same structure in the US market, they typically pay the same $1,500 to $3,500 a month as the first tenant. American operators generally don't discount colocation the way European or Asian markets do. A tower with 3 or 4 tenants can generate around $160,000 a year in total rent, and the marginal cost of that third or fourth tenant to the tower owner is close to zero. This is why American towers' domestic gross margin on rental revenue has run as high as 70% to 78%, a margin that looks more like software than steel. Stream 3, the escalator. Every one of these leases is written with a built-in rent increase, typically fixed at 3% a year, compounding, for the full length of a 25 to 30-year term. This is the part that turns a boring lease into a financial instrument. In 2020, American Tower signed a new master lease agreement with T-Mobile, a single contract, roughly 15 years, non-cancelable, that locked in about $23 billion in contractually committed revenue over its term, with escalators built in around 3% to 3.5% annually. Stream 4 co-location and amendment fees. Every time a carrier wants to add new equipment to a tower it's already leasing, a 5G antenna array, a new radio unit, that's a new fee on top of the base rent, separate from the escalator. Stream 5, the one that actually built the big players, ground lease arbitrage. Remember that ground lease you're paying the landowner. Tower companies spend enormous effort trying to buy it out entirely, offering the landowner a lump sum, sometimes 4 times the annual rent, sometimes over 100 times it, in exchange for signing away decades of future payments. Once the tower company owns the ground outright instead of renting it, every dollar of tenant rent that used to get partially shared with a landowner. Co-location revenue share clauses typically run 15% to 30% of a new tenant's rent, now flows straight to the tower company instead. It's the same mechanic private equity uses buying out royalty streams. Pay once up front to stop splitting the annuity forever. Here's the psychological trick that makes the whole thing work. Nobody renegotiates. A carrier signs a 25-year lease because relocating a cell site is enormously expensive and disruptive to their own network. You don't want to move the thing that's holding up your coverage map. That inertia is the entire moat. The tower owner isn't really selling steel. It's selling the fact that once you're bolted onto its structure, moving is more painful than paying an extra 3% a year forever. So if the model is this clean, high margins, contractual escalators, tenants who can't easily leave, why isn't this the easiest business in the world? 2 reasons. Reason 1, the capital and permitting trap. Getting a new tower approved can take 3 months in a lightly regulated rural county, or up to 3 years in a coastal or urban market with zoning fights and community opposition. Before you can even apply, most jurisdictions require a signed letter of intent from an actual wireless carrier committing to be your anchor tenant, meaning you're spending money on site acquisition, environmental review, and structural engineering studies on a piece of land you may never be allowed to build on, chasing a tenant who can walk away at any point in the process. And every tower eventually needs a removal or decommissioning bond, $25,000 to $75,000 set aside in case the lease ends and the structure has to come down. None of that capital generates a dollar of rent until a tenant is physically bolted to steel. Reason 2, the liability that never shows up in the pitch deck. Building and maintaining a tower means someone has to physically climb it. Tower climbing has, for 2 decades, carried a fatality rate that investigations by ProPublica and PBS Frontline found to be roughly 10 times that of general construction work. Almost 100 climbers have died since 2003, about half of them on cell sites specifically. What makes this a genuinely hidden liability is the structure of the industry itself. Carriers and tower owners hire subcontractors, who hire smaller subcontractors, who hire the actual climbers, a chain deliberately built so that when someone falls, the company at the top of that chain almost never gets cited. Investigators found the median OSHA fine tied to a tower climber death was around $3,750. In one Kentucky case, a climber named Michael Sulfridge died in a fall. OSHA's investigation couldn't establish enough direct control by the companies above the immediate subcontractor to hold them liable, and the fine that did land on the smaller contractor was $24,000. The tower owner's name almost never appears in the headline. Step back for a second. A cell tower is a paradox the same way a toll bridge is. The asset itself is dumb steel concrete bolts. The value isn't engineering, it's scarcity and lock-in. There are only so many approved, permitted, structurally sound places to put an antenna in any given coverage area. And once a carrier is bolted to one, the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of just paying you more forever. That's a beautiful business model sitting on top of one of the most dangerous, least supervised jobs in the country. 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1, a single independent tower. You build for $200,000. You land one anchor tenant at $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year. Ground lease, insurance, and maintenance eat a meaningful chunk of that. In year one, you might clear $8,000 to $12,000 in real profit, a decent yield on cash, but nothing that changes your life, and completely dependent on landing a second tenant to make the economics work. Scenario 2, a co-located escalating tower. Same $200,000 to $500,000 build, but now with 3 tenants at an average of $2,500 a month each, $90,000 a year in gross rent, with 3% annual escalators compounding for 25 years. Strip out ground lease and operating costs, and you're looking at $50,000 plus a year in profit from a single structure, growing every single year by contract, without you doing anything else to it. Scale that to a portfolio of a few thousand towers, and you have, essentially, American Tower, a company that in 2024 generated over $10 billion in revenue at gross margins north of 70%, structured as a REIT specifically, so it can pass nearly all of that cash straight through to shareholders. In 1995, a Boston radio executive named Stephen Dodge spun a small tower subsidiary out of his broadcasting company, betting that the coming explosion in wireless phones would need somewhere to put the antennas. He started by buying up small clusters of existing broadcast towers, 8 sites in West Virginia and Virginia here, 21 sites across the Carolinas and Georgia there, treating steel poles the way a real estate investor treats scattered rental properties, one closing at a time. By 1998, that subsidiary was independent, trading on the New York Stock Exchange, with about 2,500 towers to its name and a business model nobody outside the industry had really noticed yet. Dodge retired from the board in 2004. The company he built kept doing exactly what he started it to do, buying, building, and leasing out vertical real estate, through the 2G rollout, the smartphone boom, the LTE build-out, and now 5G, converting to a REIT along the way so nearly all of its profit flows straight to shareholders by law. It now owns roughly 149,000 sites on 4 continents. He wasn't in the business of building towers. He was in the business of owning the one piece of scarce vertical real estate that every wireless carrier in America would eventually have no choice but to rent and rent again, and again, at a little more each year for decades. That's the actual economics of owning a cell tower. It was never about the poles. It was always about the lease.